my work experience. So I would like to keep this presentation as practical as possible without going into too many technical jargons or theoretical matter. We will refer the key element from theory and technical element where it is required. But the purpose of my webinar is to give practical examples for the attendees of this webinar to implement those practical approach in their day-to-day internal audit activities. Okay, the first question is why it is important to have annual audit plan. Do we need to have an annual audit plan? So some of the references here I would like to quote from the IPPF, which is the Internal Audit Standards, which is issued by the Institute of Internal Auditor globally. There is two standards. Basically, one is the further explanation of the same standard, which talks about the annual audit planning. The key important element, if you see, the standard says the chief audit executive must establish a risk-based plan to determine the priorities of the internal audit activity consistent with the organization goals. So here, what we do not only have to make an audit plan, but it has to be aligned with the organization goals. So we have to be as practical, as relevant to the organization as possible. The further explanation in the same standard, it says the internal audit activity plan of the engagement must be based on documented risk assessment, undertaken at least annually. The input of senior management and the board must be considered in this process. So this is the very relevant quote from the standard, which we would like to keep those key fundamental objective of the annual audit plan throughout the webinar and throughout the presentation. Few things to keep in your mind is it has to be relevant to the organization goals, it has to be done at least annually, and it has to be based on the documented risk assessment. So you have to bear these things in mind. How frequent we can have an audit plan that's based on the organization industry. For example, in Google, I've read about it that they do it quite dynamically. So, but I'm sure majority of the people who are attending this webinar, they might be in a very slow tech-based or slow process change-based organization. So despite the recent buzz of the dynamic change and everything, we have to keep in mind that at the end of the day, we have to do annual plan, or we have to do planning, whether it be annual, quarterly, half-yearly, or whatever the frequency is, but we have to do annual plans. So the fundamental will remain the same. The frequency might change based on the industry and organization you are working. So it is relevant to everyone, no matter how dynamic organization that is, because at the end of the day, we have to do it, and in order to comply with the standard as well. So let's move to the next slide. Oh, this is our first quiz. So here, the first quiz for you, just to have a warm-up exercise and okay, let's see the first quiz, what it is. According to the IES standard, the annual audit plan, two options: must be based on documented risk. Second option, must not be based on the documented risk. So you have 30 seconds to answer this question. I will pause for a while. So you can choose the right answer, and then we'll move to another slides. Okay, let's look at the answer. So the answer is, first, it has to be documented and based on the risk assessment. Let's start now our main presentation topic, which is annual audit plan. For the ease of understanding, I would like everyone to know that there are three key elements in the annual audit plan: the audit universe, risk assessment, and then the drafting of the annual audit plan. So bear in mind, despite whatever the technical jargons are, despite what technical literature is on the annual audit plan. Basically, it all revolves around 2 to 3 key components. So if you grasp those components, then it's pretty easy for you to develop an annual audit plan. So the first element, whenever we talk about the internal audit annual plan, is the audit universe. The second element is the risk assessment. And then we have certain few more minor steps, but overall that will conclude into having an audit plan. Annual planning key steps. So these are the steps I further divided into 5 steps. But you can have it as many as you want, as less as you want, but these are the ones which we will be discussing throughout the presentation. The first step is audit universe. We have to develop an audit universe. Based on the audit universe, we have to carry out a risk assessment. The third element is alignment of the risk assessment is with the strategic goals and objective as per the IIA standards. And then the fourth step is the risk prioritization. And the fifth is formalize the internal audit plan. So these are the 5 key steps which we will be discussing throughout the presentation. Let's go to the first part, the audit universe. The audit universe, what it is basically. It's nothing but to break down the organization into auditable areas. This was a concept which took for me quite long to understand how to divide the organization or how to break down the organization into auditable areas. Well, it depends how it has to be breakdown based on your position within the organization and the nature where you are working. For example, in my last job, I was working with a group, and as a group internal audit manager, I was reporting to the group head of internal audit. So all the regional auditors, they were reporting to me, and I was reporting to the group head of internal audit. And the group in itself was having operation into 36 countries with 90 plus companies. So it was a huge, big task for us even to have a one unified audit universe. We had our regional heads who used to populate the regional audit universe, and then we, at the group level, we used to combine all and see that how the group objectives are, and if there is any alignment required, we used to ask them. So it depends how your position within the organization fits in. For example, I will take it in the broader picture, and then I will drill down into the company level, that if you are working in one company and you are in head of internal audit or audit manager and you are asked to make an audit plan, how you will do it. So let's take the first example where you are a group auditor and you are responsible for the huge big group which has operation in different geography, into different companies and in different product lines. So how you will prepare the audit universe. For example, in our group, what we used to do, that we have divided the entire group into 5 regions. Let's say Southeast Asia region, Europe region, African region, Asian region, and etc. So these were the regions which we have divided our organization. And in each region, we had a regional head, and each regional head was responsible for the entire companies which comes under each region. For instance, if one region has 20 companies within that region, so he's responsible for those 20 companies, and each company might be having one company head of internal audit or an audit representative. So you don't have to get into too much technicalities. The purpose of the audit universe is simply to break down the organization in a meaningful way that you can assess that how many audits will require to cover the entire organization. So you can break down as per the regions, and then in each region, in companies, and that's how you develop the audit universe. Let's say you're working in one company and you're head of the internal audit, and how you will develop the audit universe. In that, it's pretty simple, that you will break down the organization based on the nature of the organization is. For example, if the organization and the management in the organization, they speak in product lines, so I always prefer to break down the organization as the board or as the senior management speak the language. For example, if they speak in product lines, in their day-to-day activities, in their reporting, then I will go for the product line. However, if the organization speak in terms of departments and their performance, then we can break down the organization into departments. So it depends how your organization is. It's more easy to sell the idea when you break down as per the business language, rather than breaking down according to your own ease and feasibility. However, you can do it that as well. So so just to conclude, if you're working in one organization, then you will break down into functional, let's say functional basis: HR, finance, sales and marketing, and XYZ. So accordingly, in each department, then you will further break down into key major areas. So do not spend too much time in going into the process level, because it's an universe at the end of the day. The purpose is only to identify the key areas or key areas where which might help us to cover the entire organization if we want to audit them. So this is just to populate and to divide the organization into auditable areas. So after you did this division, the second element, we will move to the second element of the annual audit plan, which is risk assessment. Here there are two key important elements that you have to assess: your risk maturity of the organization, whether the organization is very risk mature, and whether the organization is immature in terms of risk. What is risk maturity? Risk maturity is nothing but to see how the risks in the organization are dealt with. There is a concept which we say three line of defense. So you can assess your organization based on the three line of defense. The first lines of defense in to avoid any risk, or to get it to avoid the any risk to be materialized, is the process level, where the process owners, they themselves carry out the risk assessment. They themselves are mature enough to identify the weaknesses, and there are sufficient controls to mitigate or manage the risk at the process level. The second level is the 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 compliance or the risk management function. These are the second tier of second line of defense, in which there are functions in organization like risk management, compliance, health and safety, in some organization fraud department, internal control department. So these are the second line of defenses, where organization, if the first line of defense for any good or bad reason they fail to prevent any risk, so we have the second line of defense, which manage and assess the risk. And then we have a third line of defense, which is internal and external auditor. There is a debate whether external auditor is or internal auditor is second, third, or fourth. So we will not go into those debates, but just for our purpose of annual audit plan, we will consider internal and external auditor as the third line of defense. So if your organization is mature, especially the financial institution, which is mandatory for them by laws and regulations, that they have to have these kind of level of defenses. So if that is the case, then your work is much more easier. If that is not the case, then you have to do a little bit more detailed level of risk assessment. So you have to define, first of all, you have to do a self-assessment, and you have to see where your organization falls in, whether they are risk mature or whether they are immature in terms of risk. Once you decided the risk maturity, then again, before going into the risk assessment, I just would like to give a snapshot of what the standard says. The standard says, the internal audit standard says that risk assessment, as we have discussed in the first slide, that it has to be documented. And the second thing, which the standard very categorically mentioned, by giving an emphasis to the risk of fraud and information technology risk, because in today's time, it is more relevant for us to keep those two elements in our mind while carrying out the risk assessment. Now, moving to the next slide, which is the risk assessment, how to carry out the risk assessment. So now the first thing which we did, we break down the organization as per the audit universe into manageable, auditable areas. First, we did the breakdown of the organization in terms of audit universe. So now we have an audit universe. The second step, what we are supposed to do, is the risk assessment. Before doing the risk assessment, we have assessed the risk maturity of the organization. why it was important. Now we will discuss that element. Let's say if your organization is very risk mature, then your life is much more easier, as I've said it, because you will take the input from the second line of defense functions. For example, you will ask the risk assessment that has been carried out by the risk management function, risk register basically they have, and you will take their input to identify what are the key risk areas. So you don't have to do a very operational level of risk assessment in that case. And you can take the inputs from the compliance function, similarly fraud function, if they have some fraud incidents happen in the past. So in order for us to do a high level of risk assessment, if in your organization is less risk mature, then you have to do a little bit more detailed level of risk assessment, because then you have no other choice in order to have a good effective annual audit plan. So let's say your organization, whether it is risk mature or it's immature, but in both cases we have to do our own risk assessment irrespective of the risk management, but we take their input, but we do our own independent assessment and to identify, because we have much more information. We have the record of the past orders, we have input from many departments, so we are in a much better position, and at the end of the day it's our annual audit plan, so we cannot base entirely on some other function. So we take their input, we respect that, and then we do our own risk assessment. So here are the five key elements in the any risk assessment. I would like to give you a simple way and try to keep it as simple as possible, and in a more logical way, because if I go in details it might get too complicated and we can take it to any complexity level, which I don't prefer. I personally don't like too much complications, so I'm kind of a person who is more objective, and I try to keep it things as simple, because if it is simple then it's easy to apply. And if your organization demands more complexity based on the risk maturity or the culture within the organization, then you can take it to a further more complicated area. So the first element in the risk assessment is the likelihood and impact. So what we do basically, when we break down the entire organization into audit universe, then we take each area in the audit universe and we further break down into different key major areas. For example, if we take finance function, if we have broken down organization into functional basis, and then we have an finance or HR function. In HR function, let's say we have different departments. We have recruitment, then we have performance appraisals, then we have training and development, then we have employee exit. So these are the major areas. So we take each area and we identify in each area what are the key major potential key major risks might be. This is it has both element, a subjectivity and the objectivity level. So some organization in some areas you might have to be subjective based on your past experiences, and in some areas you have to be more objective, taking the numbers into account. So in each area we will assess the risk and we will see what is the likelihood of that risk. Likelihood means the frequency, that how much probable it is that that risk can materialize. For example, in the recruitment, we might say that we hire someone without genuine degrees or without having a proper or relevant experience. So that can happen. How frequent that can happen? Well, in our assessment, it's very likelihood, because every time we hire, it might be possible, if we don't do our background check, that the person might have fake documents, fake experience letter, invalid qualifications. So these are the risk which is more likely in terms of risk assessment. Then we see the impact, how much impactful that risk is. Some risks are very impactful if it is in financial in nature. Even the HR recruitment might be very impactful, because at the end of the day everything will be translated in terms of productivity and performance of that person. So that we assess how much impact that risk might have on the organization. So these are the two elements, and based on that we identify the inherently how that risk we categorize. Do we categorize into high risk, medium risk, or low risk? Then we assess how good controls do we have. Do we have, we know that this area is very high risk. For example, the recruitment area might be a high risk area, and then we say, do we have the controls? For example, do we have a screening process? Do we have the interview process? Do we carry out analytical and case-based assessment of the individual? So those are the controls which are usually there in the organization to manage those risks, to mitigate those risks. So do we have the controls? So the control risk is basically usually we derive from the past history of the internal audit on those areas. So if the internal audit has concluded that those areas were weak in their control, so then it will remain high risk. If it is was well managed, then it will become medium or low risk. And after that control, still there will be an element of residual risk. No matter how much you assessment you do, no matter how much qualification or credential that person has, despite all that, the person might not perform very well. So there are an element of residual risk. So this residual risk, there are two things to it. First of all, in some cases, it's near to impossible to avoid those risks, either for the reason that if we go to that level of risk management, we might go out of the business, because in businesses, at the end of the day, we have to take a calculated risk. And for some reasons, and in some cases, those risks are not cost effective to manage. So the management decided that the value which we will derive after managing those risks is not worthy enough to be in place. So we take those small minor risks. So residual risks are the leftover risks after the controls in place. So now here we have our second quiz for today's webinar.
Okay,
It is,
Ari, I'm
yes,
sorry, I'm
yes.
going to interrupt you because the
Yes,
poll
yes.
is gonna show up, and people can
Yeah, sure,
answer
that's
the
great.
question.
Yeah.
Okay, and we'll give
So Tweet,
you a minute just so that people have adequate time
yeah. So
to
to so Tweet, can we combine the quiz one and quiz two together? Because I believe that they would have not
answer.
answered the quiz one as well.
No, unfortunately, we can't. The first quiz is already closed, so this is quiz number 2, and
Okay.
we'll have a minute to answer this, and then we'll have to uh, close the poll.
Okay. So do I read or you can read it?
Everyone should have gotten a little pop-up screen on their screen that shows the questions to the poll. But if you want to ask the question, you're more than welcome.
Yeah.
Just don't
So
do
the question, yeah. The quiz number 2 is, according to the IAS standard IPPF, the risk assessment shall be undertaken at least option 1 biannually, option 2 annually.
About 20 seconds left. All right, the poll is closing in 5 seconds. Okay, Ari, you can continue.
Okay, so the right answer is annually. Let's move to the next part. Okay, after we did the after we understand the key element of the audit of the risk assessment, here is the practical example, just for the purpose of illustration. But here I would also like to reemphasize that these risk assessment which we carry out, it has to be aligned with the organization objectives, which is one of the requirement of the IPPF, internal audit standards. So here you can see, if this is I developed this matters for my own annual planning process, because as I have told you that I believe in keeping things simple, which I believe is more effective, but you can make it as complicated as you want, because there are a lot of online resources. If you Google it, you will find it on risk assessment, and you can go to any level of complexity. But this is the bare minimum which you have to understand. So first, for example, in our group, if we have different entities, we will put it in the entities. If you are working in one company and you are internal auditor, then you will keep it one entity. So the first column could be of entity. The second is the audit universe. These are the functions: corporate governance, human resource, finance. And according to the this risk assessment, when I was doing, I keep it very high level, because we had 90 plus companies, so I could not go into further details, because the entire risk assessment was coming for the entire area from different detail level sheets. But if you are working in one company, and or the company has only one operations, then you can break down the corporate governance into different areas, and the HR function and the finance function into different areas. So accordingly, the area wise assessment will be done here. So if, let's say, in HR we have 5 or 6 or 7 major areas, and you have assessed the overall areas risk assessment, and based on that you give a one rating to the entire HR department, and it might be medium, high, or low. So the key element in the risk assessment, as I've told you, is the audit universe. We break down into area-wise, and then we have the impact, likelihood, inherent risk, control risk, residual risk. Just focus till residual risk, and we will discuss the rest later. Um, how do you rate? There are different ways of rating. Some people give numbers 1 to 6, 1 to 5, 1 to 3. You can rate it by being generic: high, medium, and low. I personally prefer high, medium, low, because we can, no matter how much someone argue, but at the end of the risk assessment, there is a greater level of subjectivity involved in the risk assessment. So even despite being scientifically very trying to be right, but still it's not that objective, so there is an element of subjectivity. So that's why I give it high, medium, low. Let's say, if, as we were discussing, the HR function, the overall, after assessing the entire different processes, major processes, and you concluded the HR department impact to the organization. Okay, the impact level. There are again two approaches to the impact level. That some people say the impact should be considered as an impact on the business objective, and some say overall organization. Uh, so I personally take it as an impact toward the objective of the organization, that this HR is a medium, because we can believe that not everyone can go so wrong in any businesses that all the recruitment might be wrong. So if it is wrong, it will be like a 50-50 case. So we usually believe that the impact of the HR will be medium. Likelihood also medium. Not everyone will be bad enough that the organization can fall down. So inherently, we say the HR inherent risk, which is the conclusion of the impact and likelihood, will be medium. Then we say, when we carried out control risk, actually based on the actual audits, because otherwise we can take the second level of defense functions input as well. For example, if the risk assessment have done the assessment on the controls or the compliance function or any other function, so we can take those things as well if we have a documented test results of those areas, or if there has been ever conducted a controlled self-assessment by the process owner themselves. But the least what we can do is we can see if there was any audit that has been performed in HR, and see that what was the rating, overall rating of the area. If our audit report was yellow or red or green, so we can accordingly give the same rating here. So let's say if we have done in historically one audit in the HR, and that was and that was concluded that the controls were medium level of effective, because there were some findings which were high red findings, some were green, and some were yellow. But overall, if it is yellow, it's yellow. So let's say based on the previous audit report, the area was considered yellow. So then we multiply the inherent risk. We ignore the first two column, the impact and likelihood. Then we assess the residual risk based on inherently that area is medium risk, and the controls are medium. So residual risk remains medium. How do we conclude this medium high, the multiplication? There are different charts available online. So when you Google it, there is matrices available where by which you can see that if it is a high impact, low likelihood, then how the inherent risk will be, and if it is high, medium, or low, whatever the rating we give to inherent risk and control risk rating, then how it will be residual risk. So I don't want to get into that details because it needs another webinar or presentation on that, because it's a very huge and heavy topic. But for the purpose of our annual audit plan, we will try to keep it as simple as possible. So you can refer those after the webinar, and you can Google it, those matrices, and simply, without investing too much into technicalities, you can just follow those matrices and conclude that based on first initially likelihood and impact, you will carry out your own assessment, and then the inherent and control risk you can determine based on those matrices, and overall you will get in a residual risk for each area. Once you get it the residual risk, then let me see the what is the second slides. Okay, so once you get it the residual risk, then this is the time of decision making. What will happen then after that? You have a long list of high risk, some medium risk, some um, low risk. So usually what I personally do, that I take around 70 to 80% of my audit engagement based on the high risk areas which has been identified in my risk assessment, and keep it most, usually I keep it 20% for medium and low risk, because I take some proportion from the medium and low risk as well in my while putting those engagements in my annual audit plan. Why is that? The reason why I keep those areas in my the medium and the low risk is because there is a greater element of subjectivity involved in the risk assessment, and I don't want to take the chance that tomorrow I highlighted some low risk and I eliminated that from my annual audit plan, and it turned out to be a high risk or a medium risk. So just in order to minimize the judgmental error, I keep that medium, maybe say 10% and 10% of low risk, part of my annual audit plan. So we have another scenario. For example, if we come across after our risk assessment that there are a huge number of high risk areas, and since internal audit has a limited resources, time, so how we can tackle that question, that problem? What I do then, I use the element of elimination, which I will discuss after the next slides. So what I'll do, I will break down that high risk into two categories, and that we will discuss in the coming slides. Let's go first of all that to the next slide, where it says how do we have to prioritize. So as I've told you that now we are come across a list of residual risk, which shows us after the assessment that there are some high risk and some medium and some low risk. So if you see in this graph, what we do, we took some, this is a matrix which shows the impact and likelihood. So the risk-based audit has taken some low risk. If you see this, at the left corner, and some medium risk, and majority like 80% or 80 to 90% they have taken the high risk. This is why I was telling you that in order to minimize the judgmental error, we have to take some low and medium risk. Okay, before going to this presentation, I just want to have a little bit more discussion on the area of risk. So what I do usually, if I have too many areas, for example, I come across 40 areas with high risk based on my annual risk assessment. What I'll do, I'll break down into priority 1 and priority 2, which is like priority A and priority B. What is priority A and priority B? This is my own technique or the approach which I use. I develop two sets of audit plan. The first plan is the plan which I presented to the which will be the next annual audit plan. Priority 2, I keep it there as a backup plan. For example, if for any reasons I'm unable to carry out my annual or any engagement, maybe because the process owner is not ready, or he's away from the business, or there is some process changes going on, so I cannot keep my resources idle. So what I'll do, I take the priority 2 engagement and plug into my annual audit plan, and I fill that gap accordingly. So that is one of the purpose why I keep the two sets of audit plan. But it is not necessary. If you don't want to, you don't have to, as long as you have some backup plans for any engagement that does not carry out during the year. So once you did this, you will have a set number of areas which will show that how many areas which you can cover in your annual audit plan. There are a few elements before finalization of the annual audit plan that you have to keep in mind, that the audit universe, you have to keep engaged at least some of the business process owners in your exercise, whether it's be developing the audit universe, carrying out the risk assessment, or drafting the annual audit plan. So it's more important that you keep in loop with the management and some of the key stakeholders, maybe functional heads, and and eventually when you prepare your draft report with the CEO of the company or whoever is the key stakeholders. Why it is important? Because once, first of all, in order for us to be more effective and aligned with the business objective, it's important for us to know what the other party thinks. Secondly, the purpose is also that when you ask for other people to give their opinions, they feel valued, and they feel a sense of ownership in the annual audit plan. And it's very practical. I've seen it works very well. Sometimes what happens that auditors are unable to identify some of the high risk areas, but the process owner themselves say, okay, this is the area which I believe which is I'm unable to assess, but I believe this is the area which is bothers me a lot, and if you give me any recommendation on those areas, or if you can carry out your audit, then we will be very thankful. Or sometimes they know the problem, but since due to bureaucracy within the organization, if they raise the point, no one listens to them. So it's a better way if the auditors does their audit and identify those weaknesses and present it to the management, they have a strong case to support that idea. So it's always highly recommended that the internal auditor should engage management at all the process level. So once you draft your annual audit plan based on the risk assessment into category A and category B, or then you have to keep some room for, we call it pervasive audits or special needs audit. These are the special requests which you might encounter that throughout the year the management might ask you to do some special assignments. It might be advisory, it might be special investigation, fraud investigation, So it could be anything. So this thing, how much percentage do we have to keep spare, or how, because we have limited resources. That depends on your past experience. So you have to assess that in the past 1 year or 2 years, how many times management has approached you for how many assignments, and accordingly you can have a guesswork that, let's say, 20% of my time I have to spare for some of the special management requests which might come. So that you have to spare, you have to keep it blank. And while, as I've re-emphasized you, the matter that you have to take the management input throughout the processes, it's effective in during that discussion. Also sometimes it come across that some of the management, they might ask you for some advisory engagement in that area. For example, when we were carrying out the annual risk assessment when I was in Thailand, or one of the process owner, they requested us to carry out a fraud risk assessment in one of the technical areas which he believed that there are control weaknesses, but they are unable to do it. So we kept that as part of our annual audit plan. So that you have to keep in account, and accordingly you can draft your annual audit plan. If you don't know, it's okay, but just give some time. So here we go to our third quiz. Tweeps, if you can just tell me that, are we ready with the poll?
Yes, the poll has been launched, and you will have about a minute to answer.
Okay, let me read the question for the audience. What are the three key components of the risk assessment? The option one is inherent risk, audit risk, control risk, or is it inherent risk, control risk, and residual risk?
Okay, about 15 more seconds. Okay, the poll is now closed.
Okay, so let's look at the answer, and the answer is the second option, which is inherent risk, control risk, and residual risk. So basically what we do based on the residual risk, we prioritize our key areas and we draft our annual audit plan, and accordingly we keep some proportion for the progressive audit needs. This is the end of the webinar, but let's have a high level look at what we have discussed throughout this webinar. We have the first element in the annual audit plan we have discussed is the audit universe, which is nothing but to break down the organization into meaningful units. And then we have to carry out the risk assessment, but before that we have to assess the risk maturity of the organization. So accordingly, we have, because the risk maturity will determine how detailed risk assessment we have to carry it out. So the second key component is the risk assessment, And then we have, based on the risk assessment, we prioritize what are the key risks which we will take into account. And in that case, also we can have a category 1 and category 2 audit plans. And category 1 is the one which we will present to the management for annual audit plan to carry out the audit plan, and the category we will keep it as a backup in case if we are unable to um, perform any audit engagement. And that's how we develop our draft annual audit plan. The draft annual audit plan is initially, when it is drafted, it is being discussed with the management first, and then it is taken to the any decision maker within the organization. It might be the audit committee, it might be in some companies, despite we talk about the independence, we still have seen that internal audit in some companies they are reporting to the CFOs or CEOs. So it depends what is the reporting line for the internal audit for the approval of annual audit plan, and accordingly you will take it to that authority for review and for final yeah, approval. Sometimes they come up with some suggestions, so you have to bear in mind, you have to take incorporate those suggestions, and then again you have to represent it, the second draft, to the same authority for the approval. So when it is approved, you are good to go with your annual audit plan. And quarterly and half yearly, as per the need within the organization, you can assess that you can review your annual audit plan, and you can tweak and you can change a little bit if it is required. So now we are done with the webinar section, and Tweep, I believe we have 15 minutes now for the Q&A session. So if you can get to those chat box, and if you can ask me whatever the question they are asking, and I would like to give my response to that.
Okay, so please put your questions in the chat box, and I will repeat them for the group.
Yes, Tweep, do we have any question, or people are still writing it?
The first question we have is, has your board ever rejected your plan or require significant change?
Not really. They have never rejected. Yes, but they do ask me. The audit committee, basically, I presented my annual audit plan to the audit committee, and they have at times requested me to change my annual audit plan based on some of the information which audit committee might be having, or they feel that some of the areas need more focus than others. So it does happen. Some not so frequent, but most of the time it does happen. And even at times, not only at the audit committee level, but sometime at the management level, when I discuss my draft annual audit plan with the CEO, which I do, he also sometimes have reservation towards some areas, and I take his input on my draft annual audit plan. And if I'm convinced on what he is saying to me change it, then I do. But if I'm not convinced, then I reserve his comments, and I place that his comments along with my justifications for selecting that area in my annual audit plan, and I present it again to the I presented the same to the audit committee for their approval. So it does happen, but not dramatic change. It's usually a minor changes in one or two engagements, and we do have to take that thing into consideration. Yes,
The next question: in signing an audit department, in sizing an audit department, are there any metrics you can share, or how do we know if we are? Oh, hold on a minute, it just moved. How do we know if we are staffed appropriately?
Yeah, this is one of the major risks for the internal audit, that sometimes it does happen. First of all, we have to see who's responsible for the internal audit resources within the organization. If your organization is a very risk mature organization, then the ultimate responsibility goes to the board, which they delegated to the audit committee to look after the internal audit activities. So the internal audit, the audit committee, basically they are the one who are responsible for assessing the resources need based on the recommendation by the head of internal audit. What One of the way which I found it more practical and useful for me, for example, when I develop my audit universe, I just populate with the information that audit universe that like 40% of my audit universe has been covered in the past 3 years. However, 60% has never been covered, and that is because I have a limited resources in terms of manpower, in terms of time. So this way I found it a bit more practical, and based on that I was successfully able to even ask for more resources. And this is one of the approach which I have taken and which yield into results. So basically I believe if we have a good audit universe, the audit committee or whoever is the decision maker, they will understand that the board is exposed to so much risk if they don't provide adequate resources to the internal auditor. But having said that, it's not about always about the manpower. Sometimes we need technical capabilities, we need trainings, we need more quality people, and we need softwares and tools. So you have to assess because it's your responsibility to bring it to the attention to the management or to the board. But having said that, you have to support your idea based on the practical ground. So as I've told you, my approach, which worked out for me, was when I presented my audit universe to the audit committee. I've showed them that up till now, in the last actually 6 or 7 years, we have only covered 40% of the organizational area in terms of audit coverage. So if you ask me as a board member, yeah, that are we have enough or sufficient controls within the organization, I said for 40% yes, for 60% I don't know. And the reason is that we don't have adequate resources. So accordingly you have to balance out between the business needs and the assurance activity. But this is how you can present it, your argument, which work out for me. Yes, to you.
The next question is how, excuse me, how can you resolve conflict with management and audit committee in case?
I personally have not encountered too many problems in terms of my annual audit plan. I believe that, Tweet, are they asking specifically with the annual audit plan or in general?
I can't say. I don't
Okay,
know.
I will just answer the both aspect. Let's say if you have an audit plan where, as I've told you, that when you discuss with the management, they were of the opinion that there are certain audit that has to be dropped. Instead, we can focus on other areas, but we are not sure whether the management is just trying to divert the internal auditor focus from the high risk, maybe because they are at the end of the day, they are responsible, to some low risk areas. So there you have to use your judgment, and if you are convinced, then you can change it your audit plan. But if you are not convinced, what I personally do, if I have a disagreement with the management, I take their inputs formally. I put it when I present my draft annual audit plan to the audit committee, I present it with their management comments or the management comments which I've taken formally from them, and give my justification to them. Accordingly, I let the committee to decide whether they want me to go with it or they want me to change it. So if they want me to change it, then I do change it, because at the end of the day, they are the ultimate responsible people in front of the board. So this is how I manage the conflict for in terms of annual audit plan. However, in day-to-day activities, we have to see the materiality of the risk and the issues which we have. For example, if we have carried out one audit engagement and we have a disagreement in terms of any audit findings, then we have to see that what is the materiality of that incident is. When I present my annual audit, my audit engagement results, I do present that this is the take of the management, and we have a disagreement. First of all, I try from my side to reach to a middle ground with the management. But if I believe that reaching that middle ground, or maybe it's not possible, then I reserve their comments formally, and then I present it with the same disagreement to the audit committee and ask for their support in terms of if they have to reinforce the decision, or whether they want me to take it a soft approach for this issue. So it does happen. So then we have to, but being an internal auditor, we have to use our judgment, and we have to use our skills, and to assess that how important it risk is or it is not. Yes, to be.
1 minute. I'm checking how many questions we have left. Okay. I'm gonna have to shorten the answers just a tad bit so we can make sure we get to all the questions. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
So the next question is, given limited resources, can you say something about rotating audit activities?
Um, I don't get it very well. That what does they mean rotating the audit activities? But if I'm not wrong, if
Not
it is
sure.
about it, rotating the internal audit staff to the processes and in different departments, and then asking for like a rotation within functional rotation. Uh, if that is the case, then it happens in I believe in GE. It is that whoever joins, usually they go for 3 years in internal audit, and then they work. There is certain time period in which they are supposed to work as an internal auditor and the process owner as well, so they can figure it out which area they want to in career they want to continue. So in some organization, yes, it does happen that the process owners are asked to spend some time in the internal audit, so they are fully aware that the risk mechanism within the organization, and they can carry out their self-risk assessment. But the drawback with that thing is there is a learning curve, there is a time which is required for example, if we have a concept of like an internship within the organization for any other functions to be for a certain period of time, or comment that they can come in internal audit and be part of the internal audit team for a year or two. That thing can help us to bridge some of the resource gaps, but in that case, the knowledge and the learning curve will slow down the process. So that's, if that is what you are meant by the question, then this is my answer. However, if I'm not giving you the right answer, then please elaborate further your question. Thank you.
The next question is, do you have capacity assessment template which can be used to assess the risk maturity of our organization?
Well, risk maturity of the organization, I don't have a template for it, but I can, if you go in my profile, I have given you a link to my LinkedIn profile where you can find a risk assessment article I have written down. In that, you can assess, there are different ways of assessing the risk maturity of the organization. I personally do it because I have a significant experience in internal audit. For example, you have to see, do we have the three line of defense within the organization? Do we have a properly drafted policies and procedure for each areas within the organization? If that is the case, that just means our organization is much more risk mature. Do we comply with those policies and procedure, or is it just for a cosmetic purpose and just to be look good in the shelf? So that is another element. Then even the the line of defense even go beyond three levels. It goes to the fourth level, where we have different committees, board committees by the non-executive directors. For example, risk committee, audit committee, remuneration and nomination committee. So if that is there in the organization, then we have a board. Then what is the composition of the board? Whether the board is fully non-executive director comprises of, or it does comprises with executive director, does they have to comply with the statutory requirements of composition of the board? So these are the elements. And do we have a documented risk appetite within the organization? um, and also the risk culture within the organization. Does people, when they take the strategic decision in the board and the management level, do they consider the risk within their decision making? So these are all the elements by which we can assess the risk maturity of the organization. So it's not a very technical thing that we need a template for. If yes, if you want it, so you can start it with the line of defenses. You can see whether do we have risk appetite defined properly within the organization, do we have the authority metrics well defined at the operational level, do we have non-executive directors within the board, where the internal audit report, to whom internal audit reports to, whether they report to the audit committee or whether they report to the CEO or CFO, for instance. So these all elements, if you combine in my discussion, then you can prepare your own template. You don't have need to have a very significant, because if it is less risk mature, then you have to put more emphasis on your risk assessment. If it is more risk mature, then even there will be a risk management team, so you can take their input. There will be a compliance team from where you can again take the input. So then your risk assessment, you have to do less work in the risk assessment and focus more on the other aspect of the annual audit plan. Having said that, at the end of the day, an annual plan is a plan, and it might change. It might be not 100% accurate, so don't be overwhelmed that you have to make it as perfect as possible. You do your good job, but at the end of the day, there's still an element of subjectivity, and it's a plan, so it might can change. So be reasonable in allocating the time. I remember in one organization, though despite our audit engagement, we used to spend like 2 months in the annual planning process. So it used to be very detailed level. Do we need to spend 2 months of our resources in the annual plan? At the end of the our performance is assessed based on the engagement as well. So then we have to assess that you have to use your own judgment and your experience. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we'll just take one more question, as we've now gone well past our allotted time, and I know everyone, it's Friday afternoon or Friday morning-ish, depending on where you are. So the last question is going to be, is the enterprise risk management function different from the internal audit function in your organization?
Absolutely, it's a very good question. I we can have another webinar on risk assessment here. We can even have a more detailed level of discussion. But for the timing, I would say ERM or risk management function is completely different than internal audit. In some organization, based on limited resources, they combine both activities and they give an audit and risk function title to the department, which is not the right approach. But given the limited resources, it happens within the organization. The right approach, that the risk function is the second line of defense. It should be separate, and internal audit is third line of defense. It should be separate, because internal audit do an audit engagement on the risk assessment as well. So if it is one, then you cannot do, or you cannot audit yourself. One approach which usually people do when they combine the risk and internal audit is that they have one head of risk and internal audit, but down beneath he have a two teams. So he have a risk management team within him. Maybe if it might comprise of one person, but there is a separate team for risk management, which is purely does risk assessment. They have nothing to do with the audit, and there is a separate audit team. So within that hierarchy, which is still not very independent because the head of the function is the same, but still there is some level of independence that the internal auditor down beneath can assess the work of risk team. But usually it's a separate function, and if it is not, it has to be separate. Yes. Yes,
Okay.
Dweep, I think this is the end of the presentation. And
Yes.
before I conclude, I just have a last word that if anyone has any recommendation, because I tried my level best to convey my message and whatever the knowledge, limited experience I have in the best possible and easy manner. If you have any suggestion for me in order to improve further in my conveying the message, conveying the knowledge which I have, I would highly appreciate. If you want to get in touch, you can see my email address, my LinkedIn, These are the two places where you can approach me directly, and I would love to answer any of your questions. Thank you very much.
That's great,
Yes,
Ari.
Louis.
Thank you. This presentation was recorded and it will be available in a couple of days. If you're interested in getting a link to that recording, you can email us at ACCA and we will get that link over to you. The presentation can also be, the PowerPoint rather, will also be made available to you upon request. So with that, thank you for joining us this Friday. Hope you have a great weekend.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.